categories of people inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Welcome to Conspiracy Corner Podcast. This is your host, Abe Williams. I hope everyone's doing okay. I just got finished moving some stuff in today. That's all I've been doing today is just going back and forth from Harrodsburg to Lexington. Last trip I made, turns out the gates were closed, so I just drove an hour for nothing. That's always fun. But got some stories I can share with y'all today. I got a ghost one and a UFO story. But I'll go ahead and start with the UFO one first. This one I actually found pretty interesting because it's left actual physical evidence. I try to be pretty skeptical on stuff, keep an open mind, but also be a skeptic. So when there is actual physical evidence of something, I find it interesting. But I call it non-identified objects because that's what it was. There were the words leading into a story originating in Campbell's Bay, Quebec, appearing in the St. John's News. Mrs. Donna Mercer reported that the object in question had appeared for an hour or so after midnight, 4 days in a row. Mrs. Mercer does not stand alone in her testimony. After the word spread, more than 30 people gathered at her home to watch the strange orange light that moved very fast and was far too bright for a star. 3 policemen were among the spectators. School principal John Lundman said that the light appeared red at the top when he watched it through his binoculars. According to Mr. Lundman, it moved too quickly to be a satellite. The news added that similar sightings have been made in recent years in Campine, Westmeath, and Petawawa. The newspaper added that strange circular burn marks were found in fields near Westmeath after the sightings. So basically crop circles, whatever it was, maybe it landed and left some burns, but either way, physical evidence, that's pretty cool. And 30 different eyewitnesses, one of them a cop and two of them a cop and one of them a principal, so some actual, credible witnesses. On the night of July 25th, while 5 San Antonio, Texas policemen were observing a low-moving, large white light about 4 times as bright as the brightest star back in Canada, a Glencairn housewife was observing a red and green arrow-shaped object overhead. The Ottawa Journal reports that the housewife watched the object for close to half an hour before it disappeared. The Ontario Provincial Police received phone calls from 6 people who were watching the same object. Theories that the sightings were reflections of a welding machine at the Pontiac Transit Mix were denied by the owner, Lawson Smith, who said there was no welding being done that night. I don't know, I just thought that was interesting. Thought I'd share that with you all. I have here a ghost story for you all. Gonna go into the paranormal. This is the governor's haunted mansion. It's located in Woodburn, Dover, Delaware. When Governor Charles L. Terry of Delaware selected as an executive mansion an 18th century Dover house, it appealed to him and his wife as a strangely serene old home. It was also one of the finest examples of federal architecture in America. Woodburn was built in 1790 by John Hilliard on a tract given by his great-grandfather William Penn. The brick is a soft, mellow mauve. The windows are large, and the fanlight over the front door sparkles in the sunlight. It is surrounded by tall pines and trim English boxwoods. Governor Terry did not concern himself with the stories that the house was haunted, but that it was at last one person who will forever believe in the apparitions of Woodburn, and in the ghost stories, especially the one about the hanging of a slave catcher. It was in his 70s now. Albert Pennington Cooper is one of the craftsmen who had done restorative work on the 205-year-old mansion. One October afternoon, when he and his helper Troy were almost ready to leave, a storm came up suddenly. There you go, a storm, setting the mood. Here is how Cooper tells the story. One moment we had plenty of light, but within half hour it was dark outside as if it were night. The wind was blowing so fiercely that the branches waving so violently, I thought some of those big trees were going to go. The rain came down so hard and so heavy that for a while it was pelting the house like buckshot. We didn't know whether a tornado was going by or just a bad storm. We would have been drenched if we had tried to make a run for the trucks, so Troy and I sat down inside to wait for it to pass over. The next thing we knew, there was the sound of voices. Strong vibrations shook the whole house. You might have thought that it was from the storm, but when Troy and I looked at each other, I knew he didn't think the racket was wind or rain. Neither did I. It was like an angry undertone of voices. And above it, I heard a shriller sound, more like a woman screaming than a man shouting. "Troy, I'm going to find out what's in that basement," I said. I started down the stairs with my flashlight aimed ahead of me. The noise grew louder. Right behind me came Troy with a hammer in his hand. Whatever was down there, he was ready for it. At that moment, the voices suddenly became quieter, and we began to hear the sound of hurrying footsteps from below. When we reached the basement, it was brighter than I expected. In fact, I dropped the flashlight to my side, for we didn't need the light. What could be illuminating the basement? So I don't know. Strange figures moved in the room. Have you ever seen clouds form that resemble people? Well, I have. We all have, but not like these. I wondered if Troy saw them too. "What do you see, Troy?" I whispered. And I don't know why I whispered, except that all around me everything was now dead silence. The forms were shifting expressively, and at the same time they were becoming more distinct. They were taking on the substance and shape of men and women. "I see some people over at the end of the basement, and the way they move, they're scared, Al," he replied. "I saw them too, but I wanted to hear what he thought," he said. "They're all huddled up together, and I think some are crying." I don't know why, but I always found it kind of odd that the basement is like one of the scary places where I guess ghosts like to hang out. I don't know. I just find that strange. There was a rattling noise and the sound of something dragging along the floor. "Chains. Hear them?" asked Troy. Now the smoky figures seemed to mill about, pushing and shoving as if in a panic. Then came a loud crash that actually hurt our ears. It was real. You couldn't doubt that. It struck me as being like the noise of iron bars falling to the ground. On and on it went, the metallic ring traveling through the house, one clanking echo after another. Troy and I took those basement stairs 2 at a time and slammed the door behind us. It didn't matter what kind of storm was going on. We were ready to leave. We gathered up our tools and went outside before you could say Jackie Robinson. And you know, the storm had stopped and the sun was setting in a clear sky. The last crash was enough to wake the dead, wasn't it, Troy? I asked. He took me by the arm, and those big eyes of his wore the strangest look I'd ever seen in them as he said, Al, what do you mean, wake the dead? Those were the dead. Well, that really gave me the creeps. Every Sunday, regular as clockwork, my wife and I are at St. Paul's Methodist, and the Bible verse that came to mind suddenly was, if a man die, shall he live again? I asked Troy, were they dead or alive? Man, I don't know. We can't go where they are, 'cause that's a notch up the ladder. But they sure can get back here. And with that he drove off in his old battered blue pickup. Now Troy was just a helper. He didn't have a bunch of degrees and such, but I always envied him for what he did have. A special way of talking to the Lord and getting answers. That was on a Friday, and I wouldn't need Troy there at the house again until I was finished with some of my own work. That would probably be a couple of weeks, so Monday I was back alone. I spent the entire morning listening to every sound, just waiting for something to happen. But all that week, Woodburn was just as peaceful and quiet as you please, and I was beginning to think that the storm had given me a super case of the jitters. The second week, it seemed that the house was extra quiet. Sometimes in these places 100 or more years old, you get used to the creaks and the sound of the wind exploring the crevices. After a week or two, it's as if the house is talking under its breath. Maybe it's talking to itself or to the folks who once lived there, but not to you. So you don't pay it any mind. On Thursday night I had to go out and have myself a little fun, and I stayed up way too late. I was on the job at Woodburn by 7:30 the next morning, and by mid-afternoon I was dragging. There was one more task that I needed to do in that house that day, but it would take close attention to do it just right. Since I had priced the work at Woodburn by the job, if I wanted to take a 30 or 40-minute nap, it was nobody's business but mine. I folded up my jacket for a pillow, pulled my coat over me, and was soon fast asleep. At 3:30 I was awakened by a tremendous crash, a noise that rolled and reverberated through the house, apparently coming from the lower level. I got up and looked out the window. It was a gray day, but with no storm in sight. Then a terrible series of rattling and banging began that shook the entire room. I could tell all of this was coming from the inside of the house. If it had been anywhere but Dover, I would have thought I was in an earthquake. It reminded me of the afternoon when Troy had been there during the storm, so I made up my mind to go to the basement. I had no sooner gotten down there than I was aware of smoke, but there was no fire to be seen, and the smoke didn't smell like burning wood or oily rags. For the first minute or so I couldn't see a thing, but when I did, there were the figures like Troy and I had seen before. Only this time, 3 were much clearer than the rest. There was a woman and 2 men. I saw one of the men lift up his hand and drop what seemed to be a large, fat coil of smoke down over the other's head. When he did, there was the most terrible sounds I ever heard, for the man's screams merged with eerie cries of glee from the crowd of figures. A loud, thunderous crash sounded again, and there was such strong vibrations they went right through me. I don't know what happened after that. This is definitely weird. I've heard and seen a lot of different ghost documentaries and stuff, but I don't think I've ever heard of smoke ghosts, you know what I mean? When I came to, I was lying on the floor in the upstairs hall a few feet from the basement door. I got up and went into the big living room, and there was some light coming in from the big windows and making a path across the floor. It was night by now, and there was a moon. There was also something else, and it was in the house with me. I walked cautiously into the hall. It was coming up from the basement. There was a muffled clanking sound on each step. I heard it stop in front of the doors of the stairs, but the door never opened. Instead, I saw a dark shadow on the door, and the outline of a man's figure began to emerge. Gradually it came right through that door, and there, a few feet from me, stood the apparition. I gasped and stepped back, but he never once looked my way. He was so distinct that I could tell anything about the color of the man's He was not so distinct that I could tell anything about the color of his clothes, but he was clear enough for me to know him for a man. I thought of the stories about Woodburn, stories of secret tunnel that connect this house with the St. John's River behind it. Stories of when Woodburn belonged to a Quaker named Daniel Cowgill, and was a busy stop on the Underground Railroad in the years before the Civil War. Runaway slaves from Maryland and all over the South were sheltered here until Cowgill could help them on their way to Canada or a free state. Sometimes the slave catchers would raid the house and take the runaways back by force. I'm ashamed now that I didn't take off after that strange figure as I watched him head towards the front door, but I didn't. I sat down on the floor with my back to the wall, and my hands shook so it took me three tries to light up a cigarette to calm down some. I didn't want to follow any ghost or even get out of my van, for if I did, I would have to walk right past its destination. If the specter was a slave catcher who had met his end here, I was sure that he headed straight for the hanging tree. There was no way I wanted to see a body hanging from that gnarled old tulip poplar out there in the yard. The tree with the hook embedded in its hollow. Either I passed out again or I went to sleep briefly, but when I next looked out the window, the moon was high in the sky. I had to get out of there. As I hurried out toward my van, gusts of winds like strong fingers flung wet leaves through the air and sometimes in my face. I didn't turn my head. Then I recalled my tools. Should I leave them until the next morning or go back to the house and get them? I turned around. When I did, my eyes were inevitably drawn toward the big poplar and the hollow in its trunk. There it was, the sight I had dreaded to see in the moonlight. Hung the struggling body of a man, twisting and turning, this way and that, suspended by a rope from a hook in the old hanging tree. I turned and ran. On the way home in the van, it was hard for me to think. I was so frightened. Why should I hear and see all that? My great-grandfather Pennington was a slave in Maryland who ran away from his master. He went through Delaware on his way north, maybe even through Dover. But what did that have to do with me? Had I seen my own great-grandfather here in the basement and not known it? Was he one of the ghost figures who had hanged the slave catcher? This is one of the several ghost stories in connection with Woodburn, located at 151 Kings Highway, Dover, Delaware. In the house also resides a colonial gentleman, a ghost who is a wine bibbler, and a little girl in a red and white checked gingham dress. For tour information, call 302-736-5656. So what do you guys think? It's pretty wild. I don't know, but just the like smoke figures is what got me. I've never really heard that in a ghost account before. Here's another one. The Phantom Lady It's in the Mordecai House and Andrew Johnson home, Raleigh, North Carolina. Surely a city that has no ghost is a dull place. Was Raleigh, North Carolina, such a city? It seemed for a while that it might be. No one at the Cameron Village branch of the Raleigh Library knew of any ghost in the capital city. Its files had no clippings of recent newspaper stories reporting a local apparition. From the standpoint of ghostly presences, everything was all right in Fayetteville, Asheville, Wilmington, and even Charlotte, but not in Raleigh. Raleigh had politics but no ghost, unless you counted the bed in the governor's mansion, from which a mysterious rapping sound once rumored to emanate, as this occurred while a Democrat was in office. However, Republicans were not inclined to regard it too seriously. That's actually pretty funny. Nor are ghostly presences enough. You also need a haunted house. North Carolina was understandably miffed by being one of the few states not included in a United States Tourist Bureau list of those with haunted houses. On one side was South Carolina with Alice of the Hermitage. To the west was Tennessee with the Bell Witch. Me and my Sammy are gonna go there one day. It's like 4 hours from here, and they do tours. You can go. They got the Bell Witch Cavern, which is in the back of the property, and then they rebuilt the house that the Bell Witch incident took place in. We're gonna do it in kind of like a documentary style, and actually like try to film like a actual episode you can watch, you know. Because we like doing that type of stuff every now and then, like paranormal stuff or, you know, historical stuff. Let's see. On its northern border was Virginia, with an entire register of haunted houses. Such a situation could make a proud state, full of colorful history and mountain scenery, seem almost prosaic. Of course, it had a beautiful ghost hitchhiker, the famed Brown Mountain Lights, and Joe Baldwin's ghost at Mako. There was surprisingly little else, though. That was noteworthy. But now, new specters have come to the rescue. Not far from the heart of Raleigh is a small historic park called Mordecai Square. It was an impressive building, the large Mordecai mansion itself, with its many wings. Also on the square is a quaint building once used as a law office, a village chapel, a tiny house in which our 17th president, Andrew Johnson, was born, and a small early building used for an office by Raleigh Historic Properties Commission. On the afternoon that I call historic properties, good fortune was heaped up and spilling over. Terry Myers was there, and I asked her my question. Did she know of any ghost stories in connection with any of the historic properties? Indeed she did, but not so fast. What sort of person was Miss Myers? Was she reliable? It was reassuring to learn that she was a knowledgeable, charming lady full of enthusiasm about North Carolina history. A former school teacher from Arizona who inspired her students to do special history and folklore projects. She had moved to Raleigh and begun working for historic properties. This next ghost story account is her own experience. One November afternoon, I wanted to complete a project at work, and without noticing it, I worked on well after everyone else had left. When I realized that it was time to leave, it was dark outside, but I'd never been afraid here. Outside, the lanterns on the tall post along the street cast their warm yellow light on the buildings and gave the restoration life. One could imagine women in these houses engaged in meal preparation, and the lawyers had doubtless just left their offices and were somewhere sipping a glass of sherry before supper. Just as autumn time is, is the time between summer and winter to pause and reflect, so too dusk is a time of day to pause and ruminate by the earth side of the day's events. And honestly, too, autumn time, that time of the year, you got Samhain and stuff, which the Celts and stuff believe during that time of year that the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world is thinnest, so could be a factor. Inside the Historic Properties office, Terry put the papers she had been working on to rest. Arising from her desk somewhat stiffly, for she had been sitting there for a long time, she slipped into her dark blue coat and was ready to leave. Standing on the porch outside, she could smell the wood smoke for someone's fireplace, and then her sensible low-heeled navy pumps were crunching along on fallen leaves. Noisy as tissue wrappings, the sound was a satisfying one, nature shredding its garments from the previous season. Terry approached the lamp-post in front of the tiny gambrel-roofed house in which President Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. This early 19th century environment had become so real to her that sometimes modern streetlights would be jarring. She had left late like this before, but tonight, at the edge of her mind, she was aware something was different. What could it be? When Terry became aware of a light, had a lamp been left on that should have been turned off in one of the buildings? Or was there a glow through the crack of the door that should not have been left ajar? Were a car's parking lights reflecting in a window? She felt uneasy. Was someone else here on the square tonight? And was that person carrying a flashlight or a lantern? This thought caused her to stop, for if that were the case, she would stand back beside the office building in the darkness until the person passed. Whoever it was would likely walk along from the direction of the Mordecai house, past the stone marker in front of the Andrew Johnson birthplace, and head toward the street. She heard the furtive rustle of leaves and shrank back against the building. The sound grew closer, and she could feel the thump of her heart. Then there was a sudden flurry in the leaves, just a few feet from her, and she almost ran. Instead, she stayed perfectly still, more rustling. Perhaps whatever it was had seen her, and knew that in a moment she would be flushed out like a frightened bird from its hiding place. Suddenly something white darted from the blackness past her. She almost fainted until she saw, with relief, that it was only a large cat, probably chasing its prey. She stepped back on the path, and it was then, for the first time, that she looked squarely at the single downstairs window in the tiny house that was the birthplace of the 17th president. In that window was the source of her uneasiness. Suspended there, as if held in the center of a small window by an invisible human hand, was a candle, its bright flame silhouetted against the blackness of the room within. It seemed to hang there interminably. Terry was staring at it. There was no reason for anyone to be inside with a candle. Then, with the flame appearing ready to go out at any moment, the candle began to move away from the window, and within seconds it was gone. But not for long. A moment later it reappeared, this time in the second-story window. Terry was genuinely frightened. Someone or something was in that house. She turned and ran toward the safety of the street. When she had reached it, she looked back just in time to see the candle, until then burning steadily in the tiny upstairs window, go out as suddenly as it was extinguished by a hand. Was it a ghost? If so, Terry had seen enough. That is the only time anything has happened to me that was eerie or out of the ordinary. I was later told that realtors had seen the same thing. By the way, continued Terry, Rosa Burt has an unusual story, if she will tell it. Rosa is the housekeeper at the Mordecai house. That actually reminds me, there's a ghost of a woman who holds a candle in a window like only like 30 minutes away. It's an older house used in the Civil War, I believe. But it's a famous ghost around this area that me and Sammy are going to make a video on one day. I don't want to go into too much detail to ruin that video, so you just have to stay tuned for that. But that's one of the places we're going to make a ghost hunting video. And this is the account of Roosevelt, her story. Mordecai House dominates the square. It was built in 1785 by a planter named Joel Lane, but it acquired its name and fame from one of the first Jews to settle in Raleigh, a gentleman of education and means. Moses Mordecai married the Lane's daughter Ellen. Mordecai and his bride retained William Nichols, a noted Southern architect, to remodel the house. Behind a Greek Revival double portico is a double-doored entrance hall and 5 large rooms. It was the earliest example of the type of architecture to be built in Raleigh. Most historic homes are furnished with pieces donated or purchased that are compatible with the period of the house. But the furnishings here were actually the belongings of its early families. They lived daily with these portraits, pictures, books, and furniture. Perhaps their attachment to some of these things may be the key to Rosa Burt's unusual experience. So there you go with the objects again. Trigger objects and or attachment, spiritual attachment to these objects. So that's something you find commonly that pops up within these accounts. Rosa is not a superstitious person, but she will never understand an experience that she had the morning at Mordecai House. There is a long hallway down the center of the house, and at the end of it is the library. On the right of the hall is a parlor. On the left there is a dining room. She remembers exactly what happened. I was there one afternoon cleaning when the house was closed to visitors, and I was just finishing up the dining room. There I stood in the doorway, wiping down the woodwork, when I saw what I supposed to be one of those guides walking up the hall towards me from the library. The lady wore a long black pleated skirt and white midi-type blouse with a black tie. I stood and watched, puzzled, because they don't usually come on days when I'm cleaning. She didn't even look over at me as she came down the hall. I remember thinking that she might at least nod her head or act like I existed, but she didn't. She came walking along just like she owned the place, head in the air and looking straight ahead. Then when she was right opposite of me, she turned and went through the parlor door across the hall. While I was out in the hall working, I was expecting her to make some noise or come out. But all was quiet, and she did not reappear. Finally, I decided to see what was going on. I walked into the parlor door and looked in. When I did, there wasn't a soul in there. That room was empty as it could be. This gave me a real start, for I knew I had seen her go in, and if she had come out, she would have had to pass me. There wasn't any other way out. You can't imagine how this stayed on my mind. I knew all of the women who were guides, and she certainly was not one of them. But even though she wasn't one of the guides, I knew her face was familiar. Finally, I thought, why, she looks just like Margaret Lane. She was a pretty thing, and I'd seen her in a picture many a time when I was cleaning. Margaret Lane was an early resident in the house. Sometimes even now I find myself going over and over it in my mind, thinking, how did it happen? Rosa looked down the hall in the direction of the library. All I know is that when she went into that room and never came out of it. If I saw that sort of thing often, my nerves wouldn't take it. Rosa still wonders, will she ever come again, the apparition of the woman who lived here more than 2 centuries ago? The Mordecai House and the Andrew Johnson home are at Mimosa Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. They are open to the public, admission is free, but hours vary. For more information may be obtained by calling 834-4844. So there you have it. The Mordecai house, some ghost accounts, and Governor's haunted mansion. But that's all I got for you all today. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you all stay tuned to the channel and like and subscribe if you haven't. That way you can check out the 2 videos that I mentioned earlier. We plan on ghost hunting outside of the house to where you could see a woman standing in the window with a candle. And we do plan on going and visiting Bell Witch Cavern and the house they rebuilt there, doing a tour and stuff of that. Hopefully they'll let us film some of it and stuff, but stay tuned for that, and I hope you all enjoyed the podcast. You all have a good day.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.